announced to sit down. Test. Can everyone please take a seat as we prepare to begin? Wow, good to see you. Can everyone please take a seat as we prepare to begin? It's a joy to welcome everyone into the sanctuary here at Bellarmine Chapel, and for those of you joining us on the live stream at home, for America's Confounding Dilemma, Race and Caste Across 400 Years with Dan Hurley. My name is Jeff Hutchinson Smith, and it's my privilege to serve as a member of Bellarmine's Dismantling Racism team, and also as a member of the committee preparing for Bellarmine's Civil Rights Pilgrimage to Alabama in September. We welcome all of you. Many of you know Dan well from his nearly 4 decades of work with WKRC-TV and WVXU, and more recently, Dan served as the interim president of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center and as interim host of Cincinnati Edition on WVXU. Wanted to note that he has an upcoming book entitled Civilians in Uniform, Crossing Borders, Expanding Boundaries. And that book is based on his father's experience in World War II as a member of a segregated army unit that helped to liberate Dachau. I'm going to refrain from any other introductory remarks and just let you know there will be some question and answer as time allows at the conclusion of Dan's presentation. But let's show our love for Dan Hurley as he steps forward to present today.
Thank you, Jeff. I told Jeff ahead of time, after doing 20 plus years of newsmakers, I decided nobody's worth more than 3 sentences as an introduction. So, and that includes mayors. So anyway, my wife and I, Karen and I, are going on the trip, and I just, because of that, I just mentioned that I was willing to try to help get people thinking about this if they wanted to. And so this is not going to be a discussion of the specific sites that we're going to see. What I'm going to try to do is, they'll speak for themselves. I'm trying to raise some larger questions. So anyway, let's get started. I want you to think about U.S. history and what would be your unifying theme. So it could be the history of the United States reflects the fundamental insight of Martin Luther King Jr. that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Certainly a sentence that President Obama loves to quote, and lots of people love to quote. Or an alternative could be from 1619 until 1865, Americans embraced slavery. Since 1865, our domestic history has been dominated by the struggle to confront and cope with the aftermath of slavery. That would be an alternative. Or a third one, Having failed, refused to confront racism, the United States is mired in an untenable dilemma, doomed to perpetual division and strife. I offer those three up at the beginning. I want you to just think about it. I know we're not taking any votes, and I'm hoping that I've got a suggestion. We'll come back to these at the end, but I want to also make a suggestion for how you approach your trip to Alabama and what you'd be thinking about as you're doing your trip to our trip to Alabama. So what I wanted to do tonight was try to, as I said, not deal with the specific sites that we're going to be visiting. I wanted to raise larger questions and challenge some artificial distinctions that I think exist in lots of people's minds. Artificial distinctions about time, about geography, so that one of my fears is that going on this trip, we get out of the habit of thinking about going to the South as going to a foreign land. Or that we think about this as Black history or African American history. This is American experience, and I want to argue tonight that this is an experience that really connects our experience in Cincinnati with the experience that we're going to be taking a look at in the South. I begin with the fundamental issue, and that is, how do Americans think about what race is? We use the term all the time. There's a wonderful project called Mourning the Creation of Racial Categories, MCRC, at NKU, run by Joan Ferrante, and on your reading list, I've got a link to that. And I've been working with this project for probably 5 years now. And I first met Joan Ferrante and her teaching partner at the time, Prince Brown. Some of you may know Prince Brown or Elizabeth Brown, who used to run Home. And their basic point was, in the United States, race is a social construct. It's not a biological reality, it's a social construct. It's something we have put together. And this image, done by a student artist, really, I think, tells a lot of the story. And for many of us, increasing number of people, including my family, the experience of having mothers and children who are different shades and colors is a reality. It's not just about skin color, it's about who we are, whatever. So the question is, what is race? We just finished the 2020 census last year. The United States government gives us some very clear choices. You can be white, Black or African American, American Indian, Native Alaskan, Asian, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, or other. That's it. And we assume that we know what white is. We assume we know what African American is. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I had it very dramatically one time when I was doing the history of Otterbein College. I was writing the history of Otterbein College. And one night I was table hopping in the cafeteria to talk to students, and I saw a table of what I assumed were African Americans. I went over to the table and found out they were all international students from Africa. They didn't know they were Black. They didn't know that color was the issue until they came to the United States. Or if you've been following the whole discussion about Asian Pacific Islanders, you might have seen some articles saying people in Asia, what we call Asia, don't know they're Asian, and much less white and Black. White is a shorthand term for people who are of European background. Guess what? If you have any experience with European history, the French and the Germans, the English and almost everybody, the Russians and the Poles don't think of themselves as the same thing. They don't think of themselves as white. They don't think of themselves as coming from a unified background. They speak different languages. They have different cultures. They believe in different religions. It really makes a difference if you're a Roman Catholic from Bavaria or a Lutheran or a Reformed from northern Germany. And in fact, you spent centuries killing each other off because whatever side of the line you were on, the others were heretics. The idea that you come to America and you become one thing called white is amazing. So one of the interesting things about that, just a concrete example that I love to talk about, there's a great book, How the Irish Became White. Now my last name's Hurley. On my mother's side is McNulty, so there's some Irish there. We never thought of ourselves as Irish, by the way. We always thought of ourselves just as Catholic. Ethnicity wasn't important. Sorry about that, Mike. Ethnicity just wasn't a reality in my family. So, How the Irish Became White is a critical book. It's a very short little book. It's a critical book to understand how this transformation took place. Because what it really was is here you take a group of people who had been oppressed for centuries by the British. Go to the Sons of St. Patrick, or whatever that thing is, every March 17th. Friendly Sons. When I've gone to the Friendly Sons dinner, and all of a sudden I hear all this anti-British talk, it's like, where is this coming from? But they still care about that. So, yet, when they come to the United States, the Irish very quickly found it to their advantage to have somebody to oppress. And who could you oppress in the United States but the African Americans? And this happens with group after group, but this really takes a critical turn related to Cincinnati in 1843. Daniel O'Connell, the great liberator, trying to liberate the Catholics of Ireland from the oppressive Protestant rulers, English rulers, in 1843 writes a pamphlet to the Irish of Cincinnati, who had published a pamphlet of their own, and he basically rebukes them, basically saying, what is going on with you people? What's happened here? And just to pull one small quote out, how can the generous, the charitable, the humane, the noble emotions of the Irish heart have become extinct among you? How can your nature be so totally changed as that you have become the apologists and advocates of that execrable system that makes men the property of their fellow man, destroys the foundation of moral and social values, condemns to ignorance, immorality, and irreligion millions of our fellow citizens? He basically gives them several choices. Either, first, stop calling yourself Irish, because we disown you. Remember, Daniel O'Connell was one of the people who aligned himself with Frederick Douglass when Frederick Douglass went to Ireland. And Frederick Douglass learned how to do public speaking from Daniel O'Connell. Basically, stop calling yourself Irish, or maybe the best idea is to come out of that place and come back to Ireland and regain your sense of identity and your heart. So the construction of whiteness was a psychological means of creating distinction between one group of people and the people at the bottom of the ladder. Everybody wants to be higher on the ladder than the bottom. This is repeated with immigrant group after immigrant group after immigrant group. It's not just the Irish. The other part of this is, though, this same thing happened with the enslavement of people from Africa. People from Africa, first off, didn't know they were from Africa. They were from different tribal or national groups. They they spoke different languages. They believed in different gods. Some were Muslim. Some followed local religious practices. They had spent centuries fighting each other, very similar to the Europeans. But beginning with the cauldron of the Middle Passage, they are all forced to begin to become something different, to lose their identity, to be stripped of their identity, and to become black. Now, Daniel O'Connell, actually a little bit later in that passage, says, where he's, how did this happen to the Irish? He seems confused. What he didn't recognize, because he's swimming in it himself, was that European culture had a whole construct, a mental, social, cultural construct that valued certain things, including whiteness. Elizabeth painting her face white. White was godly. Evil was darkness. Blackness, the devil was black. There are all kinds of unconscious things operating so that when contact occurred with sub-Saharan Africa, all sorts of psychological things were triggered and sets up this duality of whiteness and darkness, whiteness and blackness, and all of that sort of works together. And the basic point of this, it's not just for the distinctions. It wasn't just to distinguish different people, but it was to assert white over black. From the very beginning, there was a value judgment. Not only were we constructing these two races, we begin to immediately defend one against the other as superior. And that argument takes place over centuries and is argued in different ways. Initially, it's argued in terms of biblical defense, because in the pre-modern world, everything was religious, and for Christians, they used the Bible, so they want to interpret things from a religious perspective. So they argue that the Bible supported this view that whites were superior to blacks. Then, in the 19th century, you get pseudoscience being introduced, and you get phrenology, people measuring people's skulls and making decisions that the shape of the skull and the size of the cranial cavity proves that whites had greater intellectual capabilities and were superior, and therefore blacks were inferior and should be suppressed, and it was good that whites took care of them. Or, in the 20th century, the whole eugenics movement, which many of us know eugenics from its implications under Hitler's regime. What many people don't know is that Hitler picks a lot of that up by studying the American eugenics movement, sending emissaries to the United States to try to understand eugenics and importing that back to Germany. So whether it's biblically based or pseudoscientifically based, whatever it is, the point is it is white over black. And I would suggest on your reading list, there are several books I've suggested. One is an old book that maybe was one of the things that I read when I was an undergraduate here at Xavier that probably had more impact on me than anything else I read as an undergraduate. White Over Black, won the Pulitzer Prize, by Winthrop Jordan. And then more recently, came out last year, 2020, is Isabel Wilkerson's Caste. Wilkerson is using not just the racial terminology, but she's putting it in the context that to understand the way that American society works, it's best to think of it in caste terms. And she uses 3 different caste systems: India, Nazi Germany, and the United States. I'll tell you right now, I have some problems with this. I think that it's a really interesting book. I'm not sure it exactly all fits together, but it certainly is making a tremendous impact. Now, I'll come back to Isabel Wilkerson later. But most importantly, it is the point of white supremacy that is most important here, and that it isn't about any one format, one expression of that. It isn't about slavery and recovering from slavery. Slavery isn't the fundamental issue. Slavery comes and it goes. And even while it was here, in the next section I'm going to talk about how that's even more complicated. Or if you know Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, pointing out that slavery moves to Jim Crow segregation, which moves to mass incarceration. And the graph in the back shows how mass incarceration is shut up. Remember, the 13th Amendment makes slavery illegal for everything except when people are convicted of a crime and incarcerated. You're still allowed to take people's freedom for incarceration. So Michelle Alexander is arguing that it's not any one of these expressions of white supremacy, but it's fundamentally the white supremacy assumption underneath all of this that is really operating in the United States. I want to also now just sort of break from that discussion about how we use the term race and how we think about race, and take a look at sort of the relationship of slavery and segregation. And also in the process be talking about the relationship of the North and the South. Slavery was nothing new in 1619 or even much earlier. Slavery had existed for centuries in lots of societies. One of the things that happens in the New World, though, slavery really becomes closely identified with a racial identity, certainly in the United States, partly because the ability to enslave the Native Americans proved fruitless. They knew how to get away. So slavery becomes identified with people of African descent. I think we all know from the 1619 Project of the New York Times that slavery is introduced in 1619. I would be a little bit cautious about that. I think that's from 1619 till about 1632. It's not exactly clear what the status of the Africans who were in the colonies was, but I'm quibbling with, that's the historian in me. And one thing to remember is that slavery wasn't just a Southern phenomenon. Slavery existed in all the colonies. Now, Vermont eliminates slavery in 1877, inspired by the Declaration of Independence and the fact that they didn't have an economy where slavery worked. And by 1834, the northern states have eliminated slavery. Not that they've eliminated racial assumptions of white supremacy, but they've eliminated slavery as a formal. Now, those of you who are from Ohio probably know that the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, where Ohio and 4 other states are ultimately going to be created, eliminated slavery from the beginning. Slavery was never going to be allowed in this new Northwest Territory of Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. Now, there's 2 ways of reading that. Oh boy, weren't we forward-looking? That's the way that Ohioans like to read it. The problem with that is just as easy to read it as, we don't want any people of African descent here. Just keep everybody out. Because from the beginning, Ohio, which was formed into a state in 1803, beginning in 1804, begins to pass what's known as the Black Codes. And just to take 2 of the early ones, every black or mulatto person had to show proof that they were free, either born free or had been manumitted. Did they all have easy, certifiable proof? That was problematic in itself. Secondly, even if they had proof, every black or mulatto person had to have 2 white people who would stand up for them and guarantee their good behavior and post a $500 bond for their good behavior. You know how much $500 was worth in 1804? That's a huge amount of money. And then in later years, for over the next 20, 25 years, what we would know as segregation gets elaborated in Ohio, and in Cincinnati has its own local segregation laws. So in the South, they have slavery. In a slave situation, everybody knows who everybody's status is. If I, as a white male, run across a person of African descent, I can assume one of 2 things. Either they're enslaved, or they're a free black, but they better be very careful with me. So my status is very clear, their status is very clear. When you don't have slavery, how do you define the social relationship? And the social relationship is defined by segregation. Segregation is a northern institution that existed before slavery. The South adopts segregation only after slavery is ended, and they adopt the northern system. So before you get too comfortable with having been north of slavery, as Leon Litwack calls it, and that it's on your reading list, we're operating in that same milieu, in that same dynamic that is fundamentally this assumption of white over black, of white supremacy. So, in the South, what ultimately comes to be referred to as Jim Crow segregation, just a term that's used. At the end of the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, they end slavery, they grant former enslaved people civil rights, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment, which grants them voting rights. Males, by the way, only males, not women. But there is a reaction against that reconstruction right from the beginning. And that is eaten away, certainly by 1876, but legally it's eaten away by 1883. There's an important civil rights decision by the Supreme Court, and then ultimately in 1896 by Plessy versus Ferguson, which declares the principle separate. As long as things are equal, things can be separate. So you can put African Americans in the back of the bus. You can have separate segregated schools for African Americans. They don't have to go to They don't have to have schooling with white children. You can do separate but equal. So that concept is legally the concept beginning in 1896. And that is the background from a legal point of view against which the civil rights movement of the post-World War II period, which we'll talk about in a second, that's what it's fighting against. So, but it's important to keep in mind that segregation starts in the North and then moves to the South. We do not have clean hands on this. Enforcing segregation and enforcing white supremacy required violence. It required violence certainly during the in a slave situation, but it also requires violence during Reconstruction. So when when freedmen are granted the right to vote, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, in the South, first in Tennessee and then spreads through the South, the Knights of the White Camellia, they go under different names, but they're all the same thing. If you want to see that there were people who tried to stand up to this, President Grant, for all of his problems, and he was corrupt, but put that aside for the moment, he did believe in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and he created the position of Attorney General and the Justice Department in order to fight the KKK and try to stop the discrimination and the segregation that was going on in the South. There were also political reasons for that because they wanted the black votes because those were the only votes the Republicans were going to get in the South. So anyway, there's that as well. So that commitment to violence expresses itself most dramatically in the form of lynching. And there are probably somewhere north of about 4,400 lynchings that we know about. That number is low. There is still no federal anti-lynching law. Congress has never adopted an anti-lynching law. This is a lynching from August the 7th, 1930 in Marion, Indiana. This is one of the most gruesome. So they didn't all happen in the South. They happened in lots of places because the assumption about white over black existed throughout the nation, not just in the South. The bulk of them happened in the South, but not all. And this was such an affront to people that this becomes, and this is just a close-up of some of the faces that you see, people were cutting the pieces of the pants and the hair off of the people who had been hung. They created the photograph, put the piece of the pants and the hair in the frame of the photograph, and were selling them door to door. So this is a pretty gruesome thing. And it's out of this that the whole culture of lynching. There's back in the late 90s, there was an exhibit known as Without Sanctuary, and Karen and I happened to be in New York. It was when we were planning the Freedom Center. I was the original project manager for what became the Freedom Center. It wasn't there yet. And it was over St. Patrick's Day weekend, and we stumbled into this exhibit at the New York Historical Society. And this was an exhibit of postcards, all postcards of lynchings. And what you get here is a lynching on the one side, and you see the back of the postcard. These were sent through the mails. And you've got comments like, on Saturday we lynched so-and-so, and there were 1,000 people there. Oh, by the way, Aunt Matilda, my garden is doing very well this summer, especially the beans. You get those kinds of casual comments being sent through the mail with this on the front. So, and one of the things to know about this is that in this culture, and we're going to be visiting the Lynching Memorial, which I know some people have already seen, in Montgomery, there are good lynchings and bad lynchings. The good lynchings were the ones that were organized by the leadership of the community and conducted in a dignified way. Brutally, and it didn't just mean hanging people. It meant shooting them, torturing them, and burning them frequently. Bad lynchings were when people went off and the leadership wasn't in control and felt that it stirred up things the wrong way. Might also just say, I missed this, this was the inspiration for the song Strange Fruit. It was this image that caused the poem to be written and Billie Holiday's song. And if you've never listened to it, you can hear Billie Holiday sing it online. And just to read the first stanzas. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black body swaying in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees, pastoral scene of the gallant South. So lynching and violence is a critical part of this experience. And it wasn't just in slavery, but it was well into the 20th century. Might also point out that lynching wasn't just always involving hanging. So as Jeff mentioned, I'm in the process of publishing a book using my father's letters and diaries from World War II. And he was a white officer over an all-black quartermaster troop that in July of 1944 was about to be shipped overseas, and on a Saturday, the Saturday after the 4th of July, they were right outside Durham, North Carolina. There was a bus line that ran from Durham to the camp, and two soldiers in uniform, one of them, Booker Spicely, got on, at that time, an empty bus along with two other people who were happened to be standing at that bus stop, and they sat down in the wrong seats, which was posted on the front of the bus. And the bus driver told him to move to the back, and Booker Spicely argued that why should he move to the back? He had a uniform on. He was ready to give his life for the country. The next stop, a couple of white soldiers got on. And the bus driver got insistent about moving to the back. And to the credit of the white soldiers, they moved to the back with Booker Spicely and the other three. Booker Spicely decided to get off the bus before they got back to the camp in the section of Durham called Haiti. It's a segregated section. He got off the back of the bus, and as he got off, he said to the bus driver, "I hope I didn't offend you. I just felt like I needed to stand up for myself." The bus driver, who under North Carolina law was deputized to enforce the law, pulled the gun out from underneath his seat, walked down the side of the bus, and shot Spicely and killed him. 2 shots. Which set off a riot in Durham, burning down tobacco warehouses in a lot of the downtown. My father was there, writes about it. There's a major report by the Army. So it doesn't have to be hanging to be lynching. It's violence that is the key. Or, in 1955, Emmett Till. Now, this takes place in Mississippi, not in Alabama, but the difference is minimal. Emmett Till, of course, is a 15-year-old boy from Chicago who goes back to the South to visit his relatives and is accused of having done something disrespectful to a white female store owner worker, and ends up getting murdered and drowned and beat up. And it becomes a national issue when Emmett Till's body is shipped back to Chicago, and his mother refuses to have a closed coffin. She insists that the coffin be open and that people could see how Emmett had been beaten to a pulp, literally. So violence is critical, an underlying feature of American society with this. Might also point out that as we move to Alabama, Tennessee and Alabama on this trip, you've got to remember that we're probably going to be focused on the civil rights movement. But that civil rights movement takes place in the midst of the Great Migration. And Great Migration, there's a wonderful book, and maybe some of you have read it, by Isabel Wilkerson. It is fantastic. I love this book. And she talks about caste here. It's 10 years older than Caste. It was done in 2010. But she's already toying with the concept of caste. But she talks about this tremendous change, internal, that takes place in the United States. And if you're in the North, between 1916 and 1970, you have 6 million African Americans moving out of the South, moving to the North. In 1910, Ohio was made up of 2.3 African Americans. By 1970, it's 9.2%. African American population was shifting from a rural population to an urban population. 1970, 50% of African Americans live outside the South. In 1910, 90% lived out the South. Now, you can think about the impact of that on northern cities, and we do: Chicago, Detroit, Cincinnati, Los Angeles, Harlem, all these places that were transformed by the migration of the Great Migration, of all these people who are moving to the North. But think about it about the South. People in the South, as much as they hate it, people of African American descent, it was also their cheap labor. And having them leave the South caused all sorts of economic and social dislocation. So there's a dynamic background that sort of sets the stage for the civil rights movement. Before we get to the civil rights movement, the last thing I want to talk about, just want to say that it's not simple. We have, I think, in our minds that, Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, and that then triggers a fundamental change, and we desegregate schools, and we're on the way, and eventually buses are desegregated, everything, things are moving. Just to ask a quick question, if 1954 was when Brown versus Board of Education passed, when were Cincinnati Public Schools officially desegregated? Anybody know? Give me a guess. 1984. Now, there were things going on in the 1970s that made attempts, but they were usually pulled back and retracted. It's so complicated. But the point is, what we think is simple. So many of you probably knew Nathaniel Jones, the great federal court justice. Nathaniel Jones, when he was the chief litigator for the national NAACP, after Brown case, he wanted to desegregate northern schools, which were not segregated by law, but by practice, housing patterns. They were de facto segregated, not de jure segregated. And the case that went to the Supreme Court was the Milligan case, Milligan versus Bradley in 1974, and the Supreme Court struck that down 5-4. So northern schools didn't have to desegregate. And Judge Jones, who I had the privilege of doing 22 hours of oral history with, it was the critical case. So if you've read his autobiography, you'll learn a lot about that. The other thing I want to say about civil rights movement before we say a few specific things, it's becomes assumed by the image of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was one of many leaders of the civil rights movement. And going to Alabama is a wonderful place to see the pull and the tug and the push inside the civil rights movement, especially with somebody like Fred Shuttlesworth, who ultimately moves to Cincinnati and lived right over in Avondale and pastored over in Avondale. He and Martin Luther King were two very different kind of people. And even though they worked together, they weren't ever reconciled really to each other and their style and whatever. So, just to say a few things about the civil rights movement. And this is Martin Luther King and Fred Shuttlesworth. First off, a lot of people want to talk about the civil rights movement not starting in 1953 or 54, but really it's with the return of the soldiers from World War II, those African American soldiers who had been drafted and had to explain to themselves how they were going to fight in this war, which, by the way, Stephen Ambrose, the great World War II historian, says, quote, "The world's greatest democracy, the United States, fought the world's greatest racist with a segregated army. It was worse than that. The army and the society conspired to degrade African Americans in every way possible." So you have this segregated army where African Americans had no career ladder in the army. They couldn't move up. They couldn't create careers out of this. And they created what was known as the Double V campaign. Victory in Europe and then return home and victory over segregation in the United States. That was the spirit. That was their goal. So people like Medgar Evers, he served in a trucking company just like my father's. My father and some of his enlisted men are on the right side of this. He served and came back and was committed to creating the civil rights movement in Mississippi. Or Oliver Brown, who is the Brown of Brown versus Board of Education. He had served in the army and comes back and immediately gets involved in trying to change society. Or Hosea Williams, who was the field operator for Martin Luther King's SCLC. He was there, had actually served under Patton and had a lot of experience. So lots of historians now talk about the long civil rights movement, meaning as soon as World War II was over, basically a whole decade before Brown versus Board of Education. In Alabama, even though Fred Shuttlesworth ultimately becomes one of the founders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, before SCLC was formed, he formed the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, and he never gave it up. Fred Shuttlesworth never gave much up. He didn't compromise on almost anything. In fact, if you want to read something that's got a lot about Alabama, A Fire That You Can't Put Out is Shuttlesworth's biography. It's really wonderful. It's got a lot of detail. You'll end up knowing more about Alabama than you want to. So, but he is not the highly polished, articulate Martin Luther King. He's a firebrand. He's a fighter. He's a scrapper. He's impatient. He wants the Alabama Christian movement to replace the NAACP, which compromised too much. He wanted to take on segregated schools. He wanted to take on the bus system. He wanted to take on everything almost all at the same time, which caused no end of trouble. And he's operating in Birmingham, which gets the nickname Bombingham. And on Christmas night, 1956, right after the forming the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, his house is bombed. The bomb is literally under his bedroom when he was laying in the bed and somehow survived. I mean, you can see the house on the right of this slide. The whole house is collapsed. The reaction to Shuttlesworth was strong and definite and violent. The KKK operated in the open in Birmingham. In 1963, after he had been part of sit-ins at lunch counters, he had been a freedom rider on the buses, he had taken on the business community, he had taken on the police department in Birmingham. He went after the whole kit and caboodle with what he called Project C, which meant confrontation, which caused he and MLK to kind of come in conflict with each other. MLK wanted to find some way to make all this work out, and Shuttlesworth was hard to make it work out. Also, during this period, this whole thing sets up another famous figure, Bull Connor and Fred Shuttlesworth find themselves in direct confrontation in Birmingham. I mean, two of the great standoff figures in the civil rights movement. By 1961, it wasn't safe for Fred Shuttlesworth to continue to live in Birmingham. And he is convinced by Reverend Booth to take a church in Avondale and move to Cincinnati. But here's the trick. He goes back to Birmingham every weekend. He continues to lead the fight. This destroys his marriage. It made his congregation mad at him. There's all kinds of issues. And he eventually, in 1966, breaks off from the church he first pastored, and Revelation Baptist Church, and forms Greater New Light Baptist Church, where he served the rest of his life. So, here's somebody that we're going to hear a lot about. Let's not forget that he was living and operating in the neighborhood right next to us as a church. And I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to meet Reverend Shuttlesworth when he was alive. I only interviewed him twice. He was difficult. He knew what he was about, and he knew what he was after. And then, of course, we're in the perfect place in Alabama to deal with the question of voting rights. Because in 1964 and 1965, the voting rights movement, resulting in Bloody Sunday, then the Selma to Montgomery march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and going ultimately all the way to Montgomery, and resulting in and making it possible for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which in a sense ties a bow on the civil rights movement. Be careful. As we all found out last summer, the civil rights movement is only one more step in a long process for America to come to grips, not with the legal issues, not with slavery, but, and this is where I think our challenge is, can we face the fact that the fundamental issue is this question of white supremacy and the assumptions that we carry about race? And that really brings us back to the questions at the beginning, whether any of these three hypotheses about the nature of American history, or what I would really encourage you to do during our trip to Alabama, September, is to work on your own hypotheses. Work on some before you leave, work on some while you're in the process, and refine them when you get back. And what has it brought you to in terms of understanding? So with that, we can throw it open to questions. Right, Tim? All right. All questions. I started out as a high school teacher, so anything is okay with me. And if people don't ask questions, I have to assume one of two things. I've lost you, or you're plotting against me. I've had both happen, so don't be shy here. Yes?
The slide previous to this one of a group of people, don't put that up.
What?
Anyway, I was wondering if that was a young John Lewis.
It is. It was? Oh, yes, it is a very young. And by the way, I would highly recommend that you read John Meacham's biography of John Lewis. For a group that is going on a pilgrimage, working out of a religious context, Meacham's book is fantastic. It is really understands Lewis in terms of, and Lewis, there's this wonderful image of Lewis as a child preaching to the chickens. You know, and it's such an endearing, and his spirit is so different than Fred Shuttlesworth. Both totally determined men, both committed, willing to give their lives, but so different. So I really encourage you to read that. Yeah. Yes. I'm sorry, what? Hopefully they're all on the reading list. Hopefully I didn't screw that up. So, yes. So the question is, your father had a relationship with Mr. Barry, Ted Barry, at Woodward. When did he graduate? What year? Was he in the same class, 1924? No, my father graduated before that. Okay. Let me do two things. Let me tell you a story about Mr. Barry. Mr. Barry became a friend, and about 5 years before he died, I was working for Channel 12, and I picked Mr. Barry up at Evergreen, where he was living, and we went down and we walked through what was then SCPA, which was the old Woodward, and we talked about what school was like when he was at Woodward. And then we went over to Music Hall, where graduation had occurred. They always graduated, Woodward graduated from Music Hall. And this was during high school graduation season, so actually Music Hall was set up for a graduation the next day. Now I knew that Mr. Barry had told me this story before, so I knew what was possible. So I had him process down the aisle, and he walked up on the stage, and he delivered his 1924 Valedictorian Address from memory. I mean, now just to tell you what the background of that was, in 1924, the valedictorian, salutatorian were chosen not by their highest ranking of the grades, but a certain number of students, of the best students, were asked to write and submit a talk to the faculty. And then the faculty would choose one of them to be the valedictorian, another one to be salutatorian. And they chose Mr. Barry. Well, that was a problem, because the senior class president that year was a white girl. And the tradition was the valedictorian and the senior class president processed down the aisle of music hall side by side. Couldn't happen. So they ran the contest again, this time asking them to submit under pseudonyms. And Mr. Berry submitted under the pseudonym Tom Playfair. Now, that seems obvious on many levels, but those of you who maybe have been around the Jesuits know that Father Finn at Old St. Xavier High School had written a whole series of boys' books entitled Tom Playfair. Mr. Berry had been influenced by Tom Finn, by Father Finn. And he was chosen again. So now they've got a real problem. So in the end, what they did, he processed in first, and his senior class presidents processed in after him. But here's the real kicker of that story. When he left the hall that night, he walked outside of Music Hall to walk home. And a black chauffeur who was driving a fancy car for one of the wealthy families of one of the students said, "I hear a colored boy gave the talk in there tonight. How did he do?" And every time Mr. Berry told me that story, and he told it to me 3 or 4 or 5 times, every time he would tear up. And his answer was, he did fine. And I think that story was a summary for Ted Berry of his entire life. Achievement, struggle, making it through, and doing okay. He did fine. Now, and to answer your other part of your question, I can't not tell a story about Ted Berry. I think he's the most important 20th century Cincinnatian. Did the schools become more or less segregated from 1910 on? They became more segregated because Jenny Porter, in the 19th century, there was a system called the independent colored school system. They were segregated schools, but they had all African American staffs. So there was a middle class option for educated black teachers. And some of those graduates of Gaines High School went to the South with the Freedmen's Bureau to teach newly freed blacks, newly freed people from slavery. They were high school graduate from Cincinnati Gaines High School. In the 1880s, the state of Ohio desegregated the schools, which meant they wiped out all of the independent black schools, fired all the black teachers, except for Douglas School in Walnut Hills. It's the only one that survived. Jenny Porter's mother taught at Douglas. Jenny Porter, as a young teacher, started teaching at Douglas. In 1913, there was a major flood in Cincinnati, and the West End flooded every year. There was a major flood, so she went down to the West End to provide support for the people who were flooded out of their homes. And what she found out was none of the kids were in school. So she petitioned the Cincinnati Public Schools to allow her to begin building a segregated school system. She was a follower of Booker T. Washington. Washington was an accommodationist. He accepted segregation. His attitude was, you just got to make do with what you've got. And what the white society will allow us is a segregated system. But at least there will be kids in schools and jobs for black teachers. So if you drive down I-75 today, off to the right of 75, just as you start to go around the bend to Fort Washington Way, there's a building, it's a very dignified building where Channel 19 is now, and other offices. It's the old Harriet Beecher Stowe School. That was the center of the segregated school system that Jenny Porter built up, and she had a whole system of 7, 8, 9 schools all over. And those were segregated schools, and so when segregation had to be dealt with in Cincinnati, that's what had to be fought in 1950s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. So yes, they became more segregated after 1910. But the point was, you created a black middle class in Cincinnati. In different cities, different middle class African Americans are based on around different professions. In Cincinnati, it's very much the educators who are the center of the middle class. They still are today. So, did I get at your question? Other questions, thoughts? You can object to anything I said. It doesn't make any difference to me. Yeah. So you're saying when we get back, or when we're there, to notice and then comment on the color of the Alabama State Capitol building? Okay, I don't know what it is. Okay? It's an assignment, isn't it? Okay. Good to have assignments. Mac. I've done my work. Go ahead. It's a really interesting point, and I would say that I thought of that many times in reading Isabel Wilkerson's book on the Great Migration, because she talks about the civil rights accomplishments, and once the civil rights movement had its accomplishments, people who had moved to the North then moved back. They went back, and it is demographically, a lot of people did go back to the South. But as if it was all taken care of. But in post-2020 America, there's no way to think that we have dealt with these issues. These issues are ongoing, and I think that's what you're saying. Specifically, in that case, the Voting Rights Act, which was before Congress yesterday. So. Other thoughts, questions? Yes?
Dan, I know that there are some people in the audience who have Southern roots, so I want to thank you for undermining the sanctimonious history, Ohio history that I learned in public schools.
Well, the point was, if there are those of you who maybe couldn't hear it, was saying that he thanked me, having been from the South, growing up in the South, I guess. Whereabouts? Where did you grow up? Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah. Complicating the history of Ohio is well worth it. And it's not just because I was a Kentuckian by birth, although that doesn't stop me. So, other questions or thoughts?
When that lynching took place, 100 years ago, me and my dad went to it was kind of like a lynching memorial.
Yes, in Montgomery.
In Oxford, Ohio.
Oh, in Oxford.
Yeah, and it was really cool.
Yeah. The whole issue around lynching is really It exposes so much on so many different levels, and it's so difficult to face. And it's interesting to me that there is now a lot of effort. So a few years ago, we were at the new Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, which has a major section on lynching. Back in 1996 or 7, whenever it was that Without Sanctuary came out, it was almost a taboo topic. It isn't anymore. People recognize that this issue, and what I'm trying to say is, it's not just lynching, it's the resort to violence, the willingness to resort to violence, which is underneath all of this. That's maybe the most gruesome expression of it. But yes, we have to deal with it. Anything?
I just wanted to mention one of my heroes, Fannie Lou Taylor.
Yes.
To have a woman in the mix of all these men that have done great things, but to read anything about her push for voting rights,
Yep.
Mississippi, it's phenomenal.
Well, and the whole effort to get into the Democratic Convention, we forget how quickly. And that's something that we really forget today, and it's good to call to mind, that for many generations of African Americans, they were Republicans because it was the party of Lincoln. And a Republican president, I just finished, and you'll now know that I truly am crazy, I just finished Chester Arthur's biography. And Chester Arthur, who was a terrible politician and not a very good human being, but turned out to actually be a semi-decent president, he takes a trip to the South, and everywhere he goes, because he's a Republican president, local African Americans want to see him. They're the ones who want to come out and see him. They want to welcome him to their small community when his train stops. And it's, it's important to remember that the political categories you and I live with in 2021 are really turned on their head from the early 20th century. And so there's complexity there. All right? Anything else? Well, thank you very much. I look forward to our trip together, and if I can be useful as we go along, I certainly hope people will ask questions and put me on the spot. Jeff?
Thanks, Dan, for your, not just sharing your knowledge, but just your passion and your love of this region, this city, our nation, and your challenge for us going forward. What an opportunity for us tonight. Thanks for all the time you've put into preparing for tonight. It was asked about, and here it is, the reading list that Dan has compiled. Many of the, if not all of the books that were featured in the presentation are here on this list, and we can send that out digitally too for folks who are not here